Bonjour, bonjour, Annie, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about engaging with Indigenous communities. This information comes from pulling together a guide for curriculum developers, but I've adapted some of the information to this territory. So, when we talk about protocols, what are we talking about? And as indigenization is the process of bringing together Indigenous knowledge systems and approaches with those of the mainstream academy, it is critical that this work be done in partnership with Indigenous people. In session one, we learned about the relational nature of Indigenous knowledge and pedagogy. If learning is to occur in a relationship, it is essential for curriculum developers to build relationships and work together with Indigenous people. So in this session, we will begin to explore how to build those relationships with Indigenous people in respectful and meaningful ways. I will do my best, but as always, I encourage you to jot down any questions or any wonderings that you might have as we go through the presentation. So, respecting protocols, building relationships, and contributing to Indigenous-led work and learning from mistakes. These are the three main things that you'll be learning about when it comes to engaging with Indigenous communities. So, what are protocols? And when we think about the word protocol, for me, I think of the Army. That's what I thought of right away. I didn't necessarily tie it into Indigenous ways of doing things because it was just, these were things that my family did naturally. There was really no need to go in depth and explain them this way. So these protocols were taught by me seeing. So when I would go to ceremony, I would see how they lit the smudge. I would see how they would pray for while they were doing the smudge. And I'll talk about a smudge a little bit later. So protocols are ways of interacting with Indigenous people in a manner that respects traditional ways of being. Protocols are unique to each Indigenous culture and are a representation of a culture's deeply held ethical system. So they're not just manners or rules. For instance, there's some people in some Indigenous cultures, they have what they call the 3-day rule. And that means that you can't gamble, you can't drink, and you can't smoke before you go to ceremony. And I'm talking about alcohol and drugs. So that's one protocol. They require you to at least have those substances out of your system for at least 3 days. And some communities go 4 days. Some communities want you to abstain for up to a week. They differ from one community and culture to another. When you follow protocol, so let's say you're asking an Indigenous knowledge holder to come to your class. Let's say you would reach out to me or maybe Catherine Pasquatch to see what that would involve bringing an Indigenous knowledge speaker to your class. It's not unusual to offer tobacco. They say tobacco is always first because it opens up like a pathway for the other medicines as well. And that those are teachings that are immense in themselves. So protocols are, when you do that, when you show up with the tobacco tie in hand, you're showing that you respect, and you know that you're showing respect by giving that tobacco tie. Any special place to get the tobacco from? Good question, Lori. I would say no. The protocols around tobacco were also confusing to me in the beginning because, cigarette tobacco is not the same as the tobacco that's right from the field, right from the plant, right? Cigarette tobacco goes through some chemical changes and there's stuff added to it. So for the longest time, it was thought that, cigarette tobacco, you shouldn't use it. In my heart and in my gut, I believe that if that's all you have is a cigarette, then you take the tobacco out of the cigarette and you use that tobacco. I myself, I have tobacco seeds here that I can't grow. I don't have the room, but I would say you probably have to reach out to the Southwestern Ontario Aboriginal Health Access Center and ask them, as well as the Can-Am Indian Friendship Center, and ask them as well where you might get some tobacco if you want to give a gift or an offering. Um, so keeping in mind that protocols, it's just a way to show that you're ready to begin that journey of building that reciprocal relationship. So one of the ways to do this is by doing a land acknowledgement. And I did one at the beginning. It was short, it was sweet. Some people, specifically, I'm thinking about elders, their land acknowledgements are much more succinct, and they put teachings within their land acknowledgements, some of them. So I mean, every land acknowledgement is different. You might want to listen when they are having land acknowledgements, and you'll notice that yourself. But acknowledging the traditional lands that you are situated on, um, it doesn't have to be a big production. What I've been saying is, for non-native people, for settlers, is tell me about the history of your family and where your family comes from and how they benefited from being on that land, and how you situate yourself on that land. I had a young man, I heard him offer up a land acknowledgement, and he gave a breakdown of how his family immigrated here from Poland during the war, and how they were able to carve out a life for themselves on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe up near Toronto. So I thought that was a great land acknowledgement, because he was acknowledging his own self and where his people came from. And I mean, anywhere you're at, it's always good to introduce yourself. Don't let people guess who you are. And you have to be prepared to engage in a lifelong learning process. These teachings and this knowledge that I'm sharing with you today, it's all circular. So it's always going to be there. It's always going to be around. It's always going to be evolving. Um, I would hope to see, you know, I would hope to see a lot of land acknowledgements from non-native people in the future. And I do see that coming down the line, and I am appreciative of that. So the following two videos are going to be talking about cultural appropriation. And the reason why this is important is because of the protocols. Protocols and cultural appropriation at this point go hand in hand, I believe. Um, if you don't know what you're doing, you're going to muck up what you're trying to teach, and you're going to mess up with the protocols as well. Now, let's get something clear. It's okay to mess up, though. All right, remember that it's okay to make mistakes. And I think that the Bradley Dick TED Talk really illustrates the point of how that generational knowledge comes down, so that he's able to share it with us all. So these videos are going to take about, I think the first one is about 13 minutes and the second one's maybe 15. So again, I encourage you to jot down any questions, any thoughts that you have as you're watching these videos.
Cultural appropriation is something that the Indigenous community is dealing with constantly at the moment. It seems to be a never-ending stream of misuse and appropriation and misrepresentation of our culture.
We're very much positioned as something that can be extracted or taken within this settler colonial system. Our artistic practices and our cultural practices are also sort of seen as being there for the taking.
Our art comes from the land and goes back to it. Now, if you have an overblown sense of entitlement, think everything belongs to you, then you're going to be taught to exploit what belongs to you as opposed to let the land teach you.
For many years or decades, centuries, people, researchers, anthropologists, ethnographists went into Aboriginal communities and They took the knowledge, they took the objects, they took the ideas, they took the medicine, they took everything, and then they left. We're faced with institutions that are very powerful and that are so convinced that they're right all the time. And they're so convinced, using the logic of the Western art world, that they're on the top of the pyramid and that their knowledge is universal.
It constantly comes up in fashion or clothing or even in media where something looks cool, like a headdress, and without any context or understanding of why that is important.
It is critical in the process to address protocols. And why it's critical is because we have endured so much appropriation, and with that appropriation and misrepresentation over the years, and particularly through the arts and cultural institutions. Ultimately, for one not to engage in that process, the worst case scenario is you're actively contributing to the degradation of a people and a cultures of this land.
Protocols are not static things. They're not things of the past either. I think they're profoundly rooted in Indigenous knowledge. They're profoundly rooted in the understanding of what the world is.
That knowledge is critical to maintaining our distinction and maintaining our nationhood.
As Indigenous peoples, we have across Turtle Island, we all have protocols that we have always engaged in nation to nation.
I often go back to the Guswanta, the Turo Wampum, which is a moral code of how we should conduct ourselves.
For me, protocols are about presence and reverence, because I think they carry the depth of the meaning behind protocols.
If you do want to explore things, that aren't your own, that don't come from yourself, that listening is the most important thing. That you find somebody who can teach you how to respect and how to do things right.
There can be a very strong disconnect between what the artist wants to do and really kind of what is the right thing to do. And sometimes people feel that might be an issue of censorship. Sometimes that people might feel it's a non-artistic infringement onto their artistic process. And I do think it's a different time. I think we're in a time right now where we actually need to be proactive.
It's important definitely to have some guidelines in place because there's a very fine line between cultural appreciation and cultural appropriation. So it's just a good idea to know where that line's drawn.
So much of it comes back to acknowledgement. So it's acknowledgement that there's a way to approach this type of work, even if there isn't a right way or a singular way.
Because if you want to engage with Indigenous communities, then I think that you have to work on their terms. And I think that you have to be guided by Indigenous principles in doing that work. So principles of respect, principles of relevance, of responsibility, of relationality, and then reciprocity. Respecting protocols is a way of learning how to respect everything around you, not just culture, but everything. If you have respect to treat somebody's culture and somebody's song, somebody's dance, or anything with a reverence, then you're going to look at the rest of the world like that too.
And so if you don't have relationships with elders and storytellers and Indigenous communities, then I don't know how you can ethically tell Indigenous stories. Before you ask for a contribution, that they understand how that contribution is going to be used, and you have their permission and their consent to do so. We go in communities to bring something and then to take. It cannot just be a one-way street. It has to be that you are receiving something, but you're bringing something. And at the end of the day, the community has benefited from what you've been doing. Not just you, not just your career, not just your show, not just your artwork. And a lot of times, I think, in the academy and the arts, our practice of reciprocity is not balanced. So we'll maybe give something back to the elder, but it's not in proportion to what the elder gave us. And so I think now a lot about proportionality.
And as a curator in my practice, I use protocols as a way of first taking care of the people. I see it as my responsibility in my curatorial work to first take care of the people. I use it also as a way of taking care of the space. And finally, it's a way also of taking care of the ideas that we're exploring.
Indigenous cultural protocols play a big part in our work. It was one of the first questions we had to ask ourselves in A Tribe Called Red when we decided to start remixing powwow music. Was what does this mean? What does it entail as far as getting permission for these songs? There's a huge responsibility that comes with being connected to those things. That's something that we had to address for ourselves right away. It's like, if we're going to use our culture in our music, in our art form, and essentially as what we're going to show the world, that our responsibility to our community and to the greater Indigenous community was massive.
I think it's important that the idea of protocols and the practice of protocols don't become rigid and a measurement of how we conduct ourselves. I think it's a more organic form of knowledge that surfaces, and we have to be relatively sincere on how we are respectful.
I always want to caution people that make sure you're not oppressing others with the protocols. They're there to include people, not to keep each other out.
To me, protocols are an ongoing ethical process.
I think by moving forward with mutual understanding and relationships, protocols, traditional knowledge, and our contemporary practices will benefit everyone in many ways, because it gives a distinct identity within the nation. It's a form of nation building within our own nations and within a larger collective of indigeneity across a global stage.
Indigenous people, they want to share what they have. So if you ask questions and you have a willingness to learn, they will understand that, and they'll want to share with you their culture.
All right, and then we're going to go right into the next video. This one, I strongly encourage you to pay attention to how he got his teachings and who said it was okay for him to share his teachings.
So when I say Ait Squecho Nischalacha, I would like you to respond with Ait Squecho. Ait Squecho Nischalacha. Good job. You guys are quick learners. You just promised to give me all your money. No, what I said was, good day, my friends. And you responded with good day. So, Ait Squecho Siam Siea Nishwalakwa. Ait Squecho Siam Siea Nishjalacha. Asa Bradley Dick. Ahi Natsalaquangan Tanuch. Namakwa. Namakwa Tsalaquangan Tanuch. So, good day, my family. I know I have some family in the audience here today. Good day, my close friends. My name is Bradley Dick, and I come from the Lekwungen lands. A lot of us may have heard of the word Songhees in the Victoria community. Songhees meant to gather. When the first settlers came to Victoria, our community as Lekwungen people gathered right where the Songhees development is today. And that's how that word came to be. Traditionally within my language, Lekwungen meant place to smoke herring. Lekwang meant to smoke herring. Lekwanganothan referred to the language of my ancestors. I'm going to sing a song this morning as a part of my cultural teachings, and teachings that have been passed down for hundreds of years. I want everyone to please close your eyes for a moment and imagine yourself on a canoe with your community, with our community. Because as TEDx exemplifies, it's working together to strengthen our community. And we have a word in our language called nutsamat, which translates to unity within our communities. So now I want you to imagine that you have an oar or a paddle in your hand. You can go through the motions of pretending you have that paddle in your hand if you like as well. And imagine yourself paddling along the ocean. Oh, oh, hey, hey, oh. I'd like to begin by thanking TEDx Youth for asking me to be here to represent my community. Part of my teachings and something that's been passed down to me through my uncle is that when I speak in front of a group or within my community, that I speak as though my whole family were behind me, that all the people that have been my teachers throughout my life are behind me. But I'd also like to thank TEDx for including me as, I would say, an honorary youth within the group. My days of being a youth are in the past now. But the fact that they laid out the red carpet for me, I'm quite pleased with that. I'm always humbled, not only by that song, just in the pure strength of it, but also that song is hundreds of years old. Our ancestors, when they traveled from community to community, each community along the West Coast had their own paddle welcome song. And those songs were used to let people know that you were traveling in peace and in friendship. So that they knew as you got closer and closer to that village that your intent likely was to do trade or to share cultural ceremonies. And it was important for our people to have these processes in place because it was a part of our governing structure. It is a part of what we commonly term as culture today. And it's often what people see when they see Aboriginal presentations within community is that we often see it in the face value of drumming or regalia. What we don't see is that, for example, that song that I sang, we received permission from my uncle, Ray Peters from the Hulkameelan community, to be able to sing that song. I learned that song when I was 8 years old and started off as a dancer for that song. And then eventually, in my mid-20s, earned the right to use a drum as well. But it wasn't until my father recognized that I was disciplined enough and responsible enough to be able to use a drum and coordinated enough. Because drums are actually deceiving to actually sing and drum at the same time. It's actually quite a chore. But in our teachings, we have people that we need to address and acknowledge, and processes in place. And it has to be done with great discipline. And as I was saying before, acknowledging where that song came from and that my family has the right to that is showing a part of the discipline that's been passed down to me and to my generation. Now, my hope for our future leaders within my community is that I'm able to pass on this knowledge to our next generations. In order to do that, I have to work very much like TEDx in unity with my family and community. But we have a word in my language, which is sninu. Can everybody say that? Sninu. And then chisel. Oh, you got to get a bit of a in there. Chisel. And then this one's easy. I. Snino chisel I. We are becoming sninu, which is well-disciplined. And well-disciplined means we do our research. we do our homework within our community to strengthen it. And Gisel can translate to either fierce or protector. And we are fierce, because that ferocity can be recognized as passion as well. That's something else we need within our lives in order to do the work that we do, is to not only be protective of our communities, but to be passionate about our communities. And I simply translates to good. You know, we want good things to happen within our community. We want to have that balance. So in our lives, we work towards being sninu chiso ai. We gain that discipline through our lives, from the people that we work with, from our family and our friends. I'm going to leave you with a quote from my language mentor within my father's community. And it's something that I try to live by now. And he simply said, "You can't be a true human being without honoring other people." Haitskasiam.
And so what Bradley's uncle had said to him, his father, sorry, you have to be a good human being. You got to be kind. And you know, it took me a long time to get to this point to be kind. And so I'm able to share this knowledge with everybody and to bring it to you in a good way, so that you know, my driving passion here is to not intimidate you or to make you feel ashamed about what you don't know. That's how it was in the past. As we move forward, we're trying to stay away from those characteristics of learning, right? So one of the things that Bradley talked about was, you know, building relationships. To have that song passed down through through 100 years, so through generations, that is discipline. You know, unfortunately, I'm on the other end of the spectrum, so I'm catching up to all of these teachings and this knowledge, and I'm grateful that I'm able to do that. But in building relationships, when you do that with Indigenous peoples, both within and outside of your university, those relationships will be reciprocal for the rest of your life. If you keep nurturing them and tending to them as if you would a garden. You wouldn't let some weeds overtake your garden. You know, you would do your best to protect that garden and make sure it can grow and come back every year. And it's the same with Indigenous relationships. We don't have to talk all the time, 24/7, to be besties, BFFs. But knowing that, you know, you're out there and I can contact you next year, and you're willing to help me do something or achieve something, that's reciprocal. So you should be able to work in partnership with Indigenous peoples to bring local knowledge and Indigenous approaches into your course design. Now, the question I get a lot is, how do we do this? How does it happen? What does it look like? Well, there are principles of interaction that you have to remember. It's important to many Indigenous people and communities. Because of our past interactions with institutions that have been largely negative, you know, the government, the education, social work or social welfare, the healthcare system, excuse me. And so when you're trying to build those reciprocal relationships, your principles of interaction are based on these things. You have to be trustworthy, you have to be transparent, You should be respectful. You should be invested. So when that knowledge keeper is talking, your cell phone is down. You know, you're not talking to your neighbor. You're not having a discussion until that knowledge holder is done. You to be involved and you know, showing up at you know, community events like community feasts or powwows, or you know, I know that the initiative, the Indigenous Order, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting what it's called, the law, Indigenous law, they do a lot of events. Indigenous legal orders, they do a lot of events. You know, One Shirt Day, Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls. It's okay for you to get involved in these and to show your support. The quality of your relationship with an Indigenous community will be measured by the effort invested and the integrity of your team. I was raised that, you know, you say what you mean and you mean what you say, and you do your best the first time. If you attempt anything, you always put your best foot forward. And that's the integrity I was raised with. And you know, some families, they practice this all the time as they're trying to either reconnect with their traditional knowledges or their languages. But this is in practice all the time. These 7 principles come from Bob Joseph, and he's a member of the, and I'm going to probably mess up his name, a Gawakanak Nation member, and he's the owner of the Indigenous Corporate Training. He's a former professor at Royal Roads University, and he has a website that provides numerous tips and resources on working with Indigenous communities. So one of those principles, you have to establish an initial relationship. And the way to do this is, you know, you could explore relationships that are already existing within the institution. So how you would do this is search the institution website to see if there are, you know, an Indigenous strategic plan, Aboriginal Education Council committee. You would look into any research that has been done that it does involve engaging with Indigenous communities. Bequajwanang, Walpole comes to my mind because I know that the Great Lakes Institute for Environmental Research works in partnership with them a lot. If you have no connections and no one from your institution to guide you, then protocol requires that you begin by working to establish a relationship with the local First Nations. There's some protocols around consultation as well that you should be aware of. And my number one bottom line is, if you don't know, ask. Always ask. I mean, even if you just call up Caldwell First Nations and say, I'm looking to work with somebody about bringing, this is an example, bringing Wi-Fi to your reserve. Who would I reach out to for that? And they might be able to guide you. And if they can't guide you, they'll find somebody who can. And always be prepared to bring a small gift as a token of appreciation for the individual's time and energy. So, you know, a Timmy's $10 gift card. Some elders like coffee. Some elders like you know, like the coffee beans and stuff. And I mean, again, ask. It's okay to ask. That way, you're not out there, you know, trying to figure out what that person might like, when you could just ask them, and it's okay to ask. So another principle is to be clear with your intentions and your purpose. Think about your involvement with your project. How is that going to benefit the Indigenous communities? And is it going to help that community meet their goals? And you have to consider issues of compensation. This is a hot topic right now. And I appreciate that programs and departments are reaching out for Indigenous knowledge holders and keepers to come and share with them. at the same time, you have to be prepared to compensate them. And the going rate for any Indigenous knowledge holder these days is $200, which I think is fair. But you have to be willing to have those difficult conversations around money. It doesn't make anybody feel comfortable, but again, if we don't know, and you want to say, "Well, I can give you $50," that's like that's an insult. Would you give $50 to Dr. Phil? I know that's an exaggeration, but would you give $50 to Dr. Phil to come and speak? No, you would secure the funds to have Dr. Phil come and speak. And so you should do the same with your Indigenous knowledge keepers and sharers and holders. This is another question I get asked a lot. Who is an elder? So my grandma told me once that she said, just because you're older doesn't make you an elder. There's a difference between elder and senior. And so pulling together has given us this definition. An Indigenous elder is someone who has lived and continues to live in a cultural way and uses a traditional lens to engage with people. So what that means to me is that that elder, they may have lived a traditional life, they may have not. So, they may have gone through the cycles of their life, and they may have, lived experiences that we wouldn't think of as in the traditional way. But those lived experiences add to their knowledge. And if they're adding to their knowledge, then we have to trust that they are elders. And you'll hear the way elders talk too. You'll hear a difference in between the way elders and seniors talk. There is a difference. I'm just noting it myself. So here's another video from an elder. Again, I apologize if you can't hear or see the link or the video. I'll put the link in the chat for you. There are resources. I do have a reference page at the end of this presentation as well. So you'll get to hear the video, but unfortunately, just not with us all at the same time. And I apologize for that.
My traditional name is Thalamia. I was born and raised in Cowichan, but now reside with Sauk Nation, and I am the elder for the past 36 years.
Who is a respected elder?
Someone who gives support, who shares knowledge, who truly cares about community and the children, for everything is for our children.
What is your role as an elder?
My role as an elder is spiritual, and I call myself a helper, because I help in any way I can.
How do you help?
Well, sometimes I'm asked about protocol, how to go about the proper way to have an event, a cultural event.
Where do you help?
The community and other areas, wherever I'm asked.
How should we invite an elder to work with curriculum developers?
I would say to go to the community that's connected to the universities. The surrounding communities would have a chief and council to go there, and they would know who would be available and the right person.
How should an elder be invited to participate in an event?
It's always best in person. But in circumstances where you have very short notice, then a phone call would be the next. And if not that, then you resort to the email.
How should a curriculum developer prepare an elder for an event?
It's important that they would know what's going on, what's needed of them. I feel more comfortable when I know what's going to be asked of me and I can prepare myself.
How does a curriculum developer find out what an elder is comfortable doing?
So I would just say ask them. Just ask them, because they're usually like myself. I can let you know what I'm comfortable with and what I'm not. Yeah. And maybe even let you know who would be best to do it. Like, I've been to residential school, but I would never be able to teach about it. For me, it's too hard.
What should curriculum developers consider when working with an elder?
I think one of the things would be to be aware of who you have there, to be mindful, to be thoughtful, and respectful, of course, and just make sure that they're comfortable. You look after their comfort and their needs, like if they might need water or a blanket if the room is cold, or so just make sure of their comfort.
How should an elder be introduced to the class?
The teacher would bring the elder in and introduce the elder to the class, using, of course, if they can, their traditional name, and explain who they are, where they're from.
What is an appropriate gift for an elder?
I think all institutions have their own set ways, but mostly in our area here, in the big house, you will see they are always given a blanket. I'm not saying you have to give them a blanket each time here, but that is one of the main things, along with a handshake, is a blanket. So I would say probably in your larger events, usually they're given a blanket along with what we call a handshake. We call it a handshake, whereas the institutions call it honoraria.
What's an important consideration when working with an elder?
To be welcoming. To be welcoming. Embracing them, their knowledge. That just sets the tone.
Is there anything else you wish to add?
We're here to support the program and to be on hand to share our knowledge, because we grew up with the protocol and the way we lived. Yeah.
And so you heard from the elder some really important teachings there. And so engaging with Indigenous communities. This is Susan Dion. She's an educator. She was at York University. I don't know if she's still there. And in this, she talks about engaging with the community and the responsibility of and benefits for non-Indigenous educators. It is a video, but I am going to skip this video. Again, they will be in the references. So don't panic. You can watch it later. I'll email out this PowerPoint presentation to everybody who signed up. So to engage with your community, you have to learn about your own community first, which I think just makes sense. Exploring your institution's connections with local Indigenous communities. So do some research to determine what connections exist with local Indigenous communities and organizations. So is there a formal partnership with a friendship center? Is there a formal partnership with the Southwestern Ontario Aboriginal Health Access Center? These are things that even if the university or our university doesn't have these things, that doesn't mean that they can't happen in the future, right? Again, it's about safety too. These organizations also need to feel safe within the institution before they agree to, bring people to the institution. Contributing to Indigenous-led work. What does this mean? What does that look like? So, following the ethic of mutually beneficial work, identify areas in your institution where you can meaningfully contribute to Indigenous-led work toward Indigenization. So be clear about what expertise, skills, or support you can offer. In the way of getting an Indigenous strategic plan, people who are policy analysts, people who can look at the duty to consult, um, uh, to consult policies and make them make sense to us so that we can respect them, right? We want to tap into those kinds of people, and that's just an example. Be willing to commit to the emotionally and intellectually demanding work of Indigenization rather than expecting Indigenous people to do this work on their own. And I have been saying that, it's work for all of us to do together, but sometimes one part has to do the heavy lifting more than the other part. But just know that you have that support, and you have those people backing you up as you do that work as well. It goes both ways, reciprocal, right? If your participation is not needed, don't get insulted. Don't take it personally. Accept it and move on. I get told no. I get, rejection. I have to learn how to cope with those, right? So, don't be defensive, and don't take it personally. Learning from mistakes. Some non-Indigenous people may feel that it is not their role to become involved in integrating Indigenous content. One of these things is the fear, right? There's a fear holding a person back. What if I say the wrong thing? What if I act the wrong way? What if my facial expression, doesn't convey what I'm saying or how I'm feeling? I know that I feel that way whenever I do these sessions. It's something that, again, because I'm not only talking about myself, I'm talking about Indigenous people. And sometimes I talk about my community, so I have to be aware of that. So learning from your mistakes is a common act. This is how Indigenous pedagogy happens. And you wouldn't know anything if you never messed up in your whole life. Mistakes plus correction equals learning. And the way that some Indigenous teachers do that is they might gently tease you. The Indigenous people have a wicked sense of humor. And they use that humor as a way to, in various ways. And one of them is to, kind of take the edge off of a situation or anything that's going on. There is a process of acknowledging and fixing a mistake, and then it's time to let go, move forward, and continue to work together. So continually bringing up what happened in the past, he said, she said, that type of stuff, it's not going to help anybody. It's going to hinder, and it's going to make people defensive. And those are just not, that is just not the way you want to move forward. You want to do it in a good, kind way. I will play this video for you. I think it's important because Rachel Mason, she's non-Indigenous and she's been working with Indigenous communities. So I thought this was a really good video to include and show you. Once again, I'll put it in the chat for you, but pay attention to her being humble.
Hello, my name is Rachel Mason. My background is Eastern European Jewish on my mother's side and British on my father's side. I was born in the United States and moved to Canada in 2004. I've been working with Indigenous communities and organizations for 15 years. I'm going to share a few stories with you about times that I have learned from mistakes. By sharing these stories, I hope to help other non-Indigenous educators to feel more comfortable when they are learning about how to work with Indigenous communities. Shortly after I began working with Indigenous people in British Columbia, I was invited to attend a sweat lodge with some folks I worked with. In the sweat lodge, the elder who was leading the process asked me to introduce myself and tell the group where I was from. I said, "My name is Rachel, and I'm from the United States." He laughed and asked where I'm really from. Then I knew to share my cultural background. I felt embarrassed that I hadn't introduced myself properly in this important ceremony, but nobody held it against me, and since then, I have always been careful to introduce myself fully when working within Indigenous contexts. And I've gained an understanding of why these introductions are so important. As an elder explained to me several years later, introductions allow people to get to know you on a personal level, and knowing where you're from can help them to identify any connections they might have with you. I've experienced this myself in situations where I found out that people in the room share a common heritage with me. A few years later, I learned another lesson when I was coordinating a group of Indigenous youth, and I tried to use a talking circle to resolve a conflict within that group. A few times, I tried to facilitate the circle by making connections or interpretations that I felt would help resolve the conflict. After the circle was completed, one of the participants took me aside and gently explained that in a talking circle, it's important that only the person holding the talking piece speak, and even the facilitator should not intervene unless the piece is passed to them. I felt uncomfortable knowing that I had made this mistake, but I was grateful to the person who helped me to learn about this protocol, which values listening wholeheartedly until a person has finished talking, and not rushing people into their explanation or sharing of their feelings and ideas. That lesson was reinforced for me several years later when I was at a presentation where I was sharing a curriculum resource that I had developed over the course of a year. I was allotted only 20 minutes to guide the audience through the resource, and I felt rushed. I made a few references to us not having much time, and at one point, I asked the audience for feedback by saying, "Does anyone have any quick observations or feedback on this?" Afterwards, an elder who was present shared publicly that when asking for input, it's important not to rush people's responses. Especially elders should not be hurried when they are speaking, as this can be seen as disrespectful. I reflected on the experience and realized that next time it would be better to share in a way that doesn't pass my feelings of being rushed onto the audience. This was a valuable lesson for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous contexts. I have many more stories of times I've been corrected and learned from my mistakes. While these experiences felt awkward at the time, I'm grateful for all the individuals who took the time to correct me. They have been my teachers and have helped me to learn how to interact respectfully in an Indigenous cultural context, as well as many other valuable life lessons. No matter how much experience you may have doing this work, whether you're just beginning or you've been doing it for years, there's always more to learn. But the fear of making a mistake shouldn't hold you back from action. I have found that if you are gracious and learn from your mistakes, your teachers will usually be gentle and kind, and your confidence and depth of interactions will improve over time. Thank you for listening to my stories.
Erica, I see what you wrote in the chat there. And yeah, I mean, growing up, I was teased. I don't want to say like, it was just a characteristic that's, so to speak, gave me thick skin, but also helped me to learn how to like be an icebreaker, right? That's kind of like a terrific tension breaker, a terrific icebreaker. I mean, sharing a laugh as long as it's, within reasonable boundaries. It is nothing, I don't know why we take the humor out of learning. I mean, learning should be fun, right? In some instances. So this is a picture of me and my grandmother. She is my biggest, she was my biggest teacher about how to conduct myself within my family and outside of my family. So any time I applied for a job, she had always said, put your best foot forward. She was the one that went out and got me a new shirt or new pants if I needed them or new shoes. Um, and she was a staunch supporter of getting your post-secondary education. She saw it as a way, as a vehicle to move us out of poverty, right? So that we wouldn't have to struggle like how she struggled and how her parents struggled before her. I never pictured myself in this role. Had you asked me 10 years ago, do you see yourself, teaching faculty, staff, and students at the University of Windsor about your culture and what you know? And I could be honest with you and say no. I never pictured myself in this role doing what I'm doing now because, growing up, being the intergenerational survivor of my grandmother who went to Mount Elgin Day School. Our cultures, our ceremonies, our traditions, that was all left by the wayside. And it wasn't until my grandmother got older, like much older, in her late 60s maybe, that she reconnected, that I saw. She reconnected with her medicine man, the medicine man that she had known. So I'm slowly regaining these things. And I have to remind people that I am learning too. Right alongside with some of you, I'm soaking in that information. I am being SpongeBob about it. And you have to remember some of this information, like in the beginning, I said it varies from Indigenous community to community, from person to person. What I tell you here, what I share with you here, may be different when you go and hear it from somebody else, and that's okay. That's totally okay. It's just, there are different ways of knowing out there, and they do vary. I included the medicine wheel because I wanted you to see just how intense some of these teachings can be. So within this medicine wheel, for example, I'm just going to use the north section. We have teachings about the direction. We have teachings about the element. We have teachings about the medicine. We have teachings about the season, about our spiritual health, about non-native people, about our elders, who are our grandparents. And within those, there's an abundance of teachings. It would take longer than, an hour and a half to even go through this medicine wheel in depth. And this is just an example. There are many medicine wheels out there, and I just want to say it's a pan-Indian symbol. So I'm getting notice to switch my headset. Let me know if you can't hear me at any point. But the medicine wheel comes from the Lakota, comes from their teachings. And so a lot of Indigenous cultures, communities have adapted it because it is so succinct in enveloping our teachings and our knowledge. Here is the reference slide that I was talking about. Again, I will email this presentation to all of you shortly after we say our goodbyes here today. And on that note, it is 2:32, and we are, this session is ending, but if you have questions, I'm more than happy to stay on.